I'm going to join back in a second.
And we're live.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another OWASP Toronto chapter meetup. My name is Adam, and I'll be your host for this evening. We have two exciting presentations today. First, we have Eli and Viplev, who will be talking to us about threat modeling. And then after, we have Connor McKinnon, who will be talking to us about designing a security champions program. But before we get to that, a couple of housekeeping items. For starters, we have a link in the description of this video. You can use that to provide your feedback or suggest future events that we can talk about. Also, if you're looking for CPE credits, use that link to provide your name and email address so we can use to verify that you've watched this presentation. Also, if you have any questions during the course of this presentation, just leave it in the chat. We will be periodically reviewing the comments and asking them to our speakers throughout the presentation. Also, if you're hiring or looking for work, share that in the comments now. In terms of our next events, we have an exciting presentation in December where we will be hosting John Simpson from Trend Micro, who will be talking to us about exploit development. And if you're free next week, the OWASP Toronto team will be going to ISC Squared Cyber Toronto. We have a panel and we have a presentation where we will be talking about the various OWASP projects. And that's it for me. Eli and Viplev, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, OWASP team, for having me back. It's great to be here. So today, Viplev and I will be talking to you about threat modeling, what it is, and specifically about how we do threat modeling at Synopsys. So the agenda for today is the breakdown on threat modeling, what it is the goals of threat modeling, and how we at Synopsys do it to help our clients. And then we're also going to have Q&A. We'll be pausing a few times during Q&A as well, during the presentation to answer questions throughout the presentation as well. So from introductions perspective, my name is Eli. I'm a managing principal for Synopsys, based out of Toronto. I lead the practice for a local Canadian practice. And I've been working in application security for about 20 years, starting as a developer and then moving through various roles. We also have on a call Viplev, who's one of our senior consultants from Synopsys and who's actually one of our threat modeling leads. So he has a lot of experience leading and doing these kind of engagements and building threat models across a variety of clients. Okay, so let's talk about what is threat modeling. So when we think about threat modeling, we think of a number of things. We think about assets, we think about controls, attack surface, threat agents, trust zones, and other different things like this. But what exactly is threat modeling? And what is the purpose of threat modeling? Okay, and is it really that difficult to do to begin with? There are many different ways, the way people define threat modeling. But at the end of the day, it's another technique to identify security risks in your system. You have other techniques such as code reviews who look at the code. You have dynamic testing techniques that find issues in the running applications. But threat modeling is another technique to find issues based on a paper-based exercise in your design or architecture. Okay, so it is a security assessment technique to find potential design flaws, architecture flaws, or the ways people may attack your system. Okay, and what is the purpose of threat modeling? There may be many different purposes for doing threat modeling, and we'll cover more of them in details later. But two of the main ones are helping build your security requirements. So once you understand how people may want to attack your system, you can go back and define your security requirements, both functional and non-functional, as well as identify issues, for the most part, in your design and architecture, so you can go ahead and fix them. Okay, so how you actually do threat modeling? Based on our experience, there are three main steps. First, you want to understand what are you building, right? So what is that you're going to threat model? Two, you want to think through what can go wrong with your system, with your design. And third, which is probably the most important step, what are you going to actually do about it? And the reason, in my opinion, it's the most important step is because a lot of people look for issues, but if you don't do anything with them, then there's really not that much point. And there are many different things that you can use threat modeling report for, and how you use it is really probably the most crucial step. Okay. So the other thing, threat modeling is intuitive. And without realizing, all of us, we do threat modeling on a regular basis. So think about it. Let's say pre-pandemic days, you went to a nice Japanese restaurant and they were serving you raw fish. Most likely, majority of us would be okay eating raw fish at the restaurant like that. However, imagine you're going through a gas station on a hot summer day and they have raw fish sitting there on a counter, and air conditioner is not working in the gas station. The number of people who would probably buy to eat that for lunch is going to be significantly lower. So this is an example of intuitive threat modeling that we think through. What are the rewards if we buy the food? And what are the threats? What are the things that could happen if we actually do that? Okay, so it is intuitive. Okay, so let's go through these 3 steps in more details. So the first step, what are we building? Okay, and to understand what we're building, we need to have a model of what we can analyze. And there are many different models out there. And usually these models are built to answer specific questions or to achieve certain goals. So you may have a deployment diagram, and deployment diagram is really there for your operations engineers to understand what you have within your organization, where it is. You may have a system diagram, and the goal there is to understand what are the various systems and who interacts with who. And then you can also have data flow diagrams, and they're to show you how the data flows. But really, these type of diagrams are not helping you to achieve your goal of threat modeling, which is to answer what can go wrong with your system. So what that means is that if you really want to do threat modeling, you need to build a model of your system in such a way that it helps you answer the set question, what can go wrong. Okay. So what are we building? Right? How do we actually build a model like that? One step, we need to gather the information. So you see there are interviews. You either interview the people who actually build the system, or at the same time you review the documentation. You think about various parts. You think about your components. You think about your controls, assets, trust zones, channels. All those different parts that you should care about when you're going to try to answer the question, what could go wrong, right? So all those different things will go into your model of what you're building. So let's take a look at an example. I'm hoping most of you heard of Microsoft Stride, which is one of the more popular threat modeling methodologies out there. And this is an example of the model that they built to do analysis using Stride, right? Over here, you have this particular methodology is highly dependent on data flow analysis, right? And this is based on a software-centric approach to threat modeling. And this is important. Stride was built with software-centric approach. And as we go through the next few slides, you will see that different threat modeling approaches were built using different things that they look at, right? And here, in this particular model, attackers often interact with their targets for inbound and outbound data flows. So understanding the entry points is important, right? So that's an example of a model that you build in part of Stride, okay? On the next slide, we have a slightly different way to represent the system. And this is a way we represent and model the system to help us do our threat modeling analysis. And on a system like that, you see there is a number of components that we identify. We identify various trust zones. You have different assets within the system and where they're located. And you also see various controls that are implemented as orange. Controls are the green boxes, and assets are the orange boxes. And then you also see those devilish-looking characters that meant to represent your threat agents. So that's another way to model a system to help you think through the question, what can go wrong? Okay. So let's talk about what can go wrong and how do you actually do that? Okay. So for us to think through what can go wrong, we need to have some guardrails. As I said at the beginning, threat modeling is intuitive, but at the same time, relying on intuition alone is not enough to produce systematic, repeatable results to give you high quality understanding of the threats to the system, right? So what do you usually hear when people telling you how to do threat modeling? They say, well, think like a hacker, right? Is that really useful? It's like telling a hunter, take this gun, go to the forest and hunt like a hunter. Is that really a useful advice? Not really. So you need to have a threat modeling methodology, an approach of how you're gonna systematically review the model that you built to help identify threats and to truly think what could go wrong, okay? So as you do that, you need to think about what methodology you're gonna use. And there are many different methodologies out there. So the most popular one is Stride, that we talked to briefly about. And it was created in Microsoft in 1999, and it was widely adopted in 2002. And this is a checklist-based approach. It's fairly mature and widely adopted. And the main way they do threat modeling in Stride is by looking at your data flows. Now, as you think of different approaches, what's important to understand is that there is no one approach that works for everybody. All these approaches have their pros and cons. So when you think about which one you want to use within your organization or as a consultant, it's important to understand why those methodologies were built in the first place, and because that will tell you the scenarios where they most likely be applicable. So for example, Stride was built by Microsoft to analyze communication between various components within their Windows operating system. And their data flows were crucial. So they built the threat modeling approach to help them analyze what mattered to them. So if you have an organization and you need to do analysis of various protocols that you're building and really, really dig deep to understand all the various threats, then you may want to use Stride and really dig deep on various data flows. But if you have different kind of systems or different kind of objectives or different kind of technology stacks, which is a lot more common nowadays, it may not be the answer for you, right? There's a whole bunch of other methodologies out there. One of them is security cards, and security cards is really meant for brainstorming sessions with an expert in the room to dig deep into the creative part of thinking. And that could be useful for teaching purposes. That could be useful in group settings to do some initial brainstorming, right? There's a few other methodologies out there. Persona non grata, PNG, that was developed as an attacker-centric threat model. So you would be building attacker profiles and using that to identify the threats. And then on the next slide, we have a few other methodologies out there. Now, we're not going to go through all of them, but the point here is to understand that there's many different methodologies. You want to understand why they were built in the first place to see if this is the right methodology for you. Okay. So let's talk about what we're going to do about it. So as I said, in my opinion, that's probably the most important thing about threat modeling. You built your model, you thought about what could go wrong, what are you going to do with the results? And there are many, many different ways to use results of the threat modeling. One, you can help improve the security of the system that you analyzed, right? Threat modeling helps you identify design flaws in your systems or applications that you can go and fix. It can also identify security requirements that you can go back and bake into your system and application to to ensure that you have them. It can also help you identify some of the issues in your applications early in SDLC before you do some of the activities towards the right side of your SDLC, such as pen testing. But there are other ways to use threat model. And that is, to me, I call them feedback loops. One of the most common feedback loops that I've seen is taking the results of a threat model and sharing it with your penetration testing team so they can see what the system is built, and threat model becomes a blueprint for them on how to think about attacking the system in scope. But that's truly not the only feedback loop that you can have for helping consume the outputs of a threat model. You can look at the outputs of a threat model to identify common architectural challenges that your applications have across the organization, to identify a need for common design patterns. So you may find out that you have multiple applications and they're all trying to figure out how to do proper SAML integration, and they're all doing it in a different way. So maybe you decide that, hey, that's a good idea to build a design pattern, so now we can have an approved way of doing certain things within the organization so that everybody can reuse it. So you can use threat modeling to identify the blocks, architectural patterns, design patterns that you want to build that you can reuse, right? So that's an example of a few different feedback loops out there that you can use threat modeling for. Okay. So then, before I hand it over to Viplav to walk us through the Synopsis approach, let me explain where it came from so you understand why do we have it in the first place. So we started doing threat modeling at Synopsys, and we were called Cigital at that time, about 15, 20 years ago. And we were engaged by our clients who wanted to look at some of the critical assets, critical applications to understand what are the architectural flaws. So as consultants, we needed an approach that would work in all the kind of different situations that we could translate, not just do it for web applications, but we could do it for game consoles, thick clients, IoT, all kind of different systems that could be reusable. We were also engaged to do time-boxed assessments, and client wanted thorough analysis. So we were not looking to build, half a day, or 2-day threat modeling exercise, but we needed to go deeper than that. And at that time, most of those assessments were like 4, 6, 8 weeks of effort. And we had to time box it to a reasonable amount so that we could give the most value to our clients for the money that they wanted to spend. So that's where the approach came from. Over time, it evolved. Personally, I've seen threat models using this approach last as little as a week and a half to 2 weeks of effort, all the way to 15 weeks of effort. And it all depends on how big or complex the system and scope is, and how deep do you want to go with your analysis before before it's not reasonable to go any further, and it's not doesn't create great returns on additional effort. So that's where the Synopsis approach came from. Okay. Now I'm sure you guys probably have questions about, well, how do you scale something like that in large organizations? How do you make it work in DevSecOps environment where this needs to happen much faster? And honestly, these are all very good questions, and we do have a very different deck on that. So if a OWASP team wants to bring us back to talk about how to scale it and make these threat modeling exercises go much faster, we can talk about that as well, but that's a slightly different presentation. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Viplav to walk us through Synopsis Threat Modeling Approach.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you for providing a good overview of what Synopsys' approach to threat model is. I'm going to walk you through what exactly the approach that we follow at Synopsys is. So as you can see, the tree diagram which is shown here, Synopsys threat modeling can be broadly categorized into 3 major activities. The first one is modeling the application or the system. The second activity is performing the threat analysis. And the third activity is threat prioritization. And essentially each and every activity has some subtasks that we want to complete at that level. So let's go into the first activity, that is modeling the application. What does that mean? So if you can go to the next slide. So modeling the application has its own like subtask, as I mentioned. So what are those? Those are creating a component diagram, identifying the assets, identifying the security controls present, identifying the threat agents, and identifying the trust zones. So what do all these means? Let me walk through each and every task that I just described. So the first one, if you can go to the next slide, creating the component diagram. So what this essentially means is the first step to Synopsis approach is creating a logical diagram of the system. This is a little different from the deployment diagram. We create a component diagram based on our understanding of the system, representing the control flow graph, which is essentially all the possible execution paths of a system. And you can use any tool for this. It can be draw.io or Visio, like whatever you prefer. So once you have created the component diagram and represented all the flows, the next step is to identify assets. So if you can go to the next slide, what are assets? So assets can be data, functionality, or a component itself that system must protect. For example, an asset can be PII data, an asset can be secrets, an asset can be some configuration data, an asset can be a privileged API, like which the only admin should have access to. So depending upon the system we are analyzing, these assets vary. And I'll try to walk you through one hypothetical system that I've created here, and then we'll try to identify some of the assets which is present in this system. So if you can go to the next slide. Are you able to zoom a little? I'm not sure if it's visible, but so this is the hypothetical system. Essentially, it is like an application which provides you employee benefits information. So the users can use this application either through a web browser or a mobile application, which is represented on the top left. And then you have to authenticate yourself using your employee credentials. And once a user is authenticated, a user is provided a session token by the server. And consecutively, all those requests will contain this token to get the benefits information out of the system. This system is a containerized application which is deployed in Kubernetes, and we are using one of the cloud services as the infrastructure. So let's try to identify some of the assets here. So as I mentioned, assets can be like data, functionality, or API that you want to protect. So for example, let's take a user wants to, when the user wants to access this system, it needs to provide a username and password. So the username and password, the user credentials becomes an asset. Uh, Once a user is successfully authenticated, the server provides a session token, which essentially is the identity of the user. So the session token can be one asset. The whole application is deployed as a container onto the Kubernetes, and we are using Docker as the runtime container runtime. So these Docker images can be one asset. The server connects to the database to fetch the application data. And to do that, it requires the database credentials. So in that case, the database credential becomes an asset. And the application data, the employee benefits information itself, can be an asset. So these are some of the assets represented here. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just to give you an idea how to identify assets and how they vary depending upon the system. So once we have created the component diagram, once we have identified the assets, the next step is to identify the security controls. So if you can move to the next slide. So what are these security controls? So controls are protections that are implemented into the system to protect these assets. Some of the controls can be authentication. Authorization is another example of a security control. Encryption can be another control, and so on and so forth. So we'll take the same example, the same system, and we'll try to identify some of the controls which are present in this system. So to start with, this application cannot be like a user cannot fetch the data without providing username and password. So in this case, the authentication can be a control. So which is represented as the green boxes. As Ellie mentioned earlier, all the beige, brown, orange boxes on this diagram are assets, and all the green colored boxes are the controls. So the next, the user can also use a mobile application to access these benefits information. And the mobile application itself has some cert pinning implementation to prevent against MITM attacks. So the cert pinning becomes another control. All the traffic from the internet, whether the user is using mobile application or a web app, is controlled or filtered through a corporate ingress firewall. So the firewall becomes another control. The the user credentials are stored at the Active Directory as bcrypt hashes. So the hashed credentials becomes another control. The Docker images which are stored at the Docker Trust Registry, they are signed so that they can be verified at the time of deployment. So that Docker image signing becomes another control, and so on and so forth. There is another control which is Kubernetes specific, which is namespace isolation. So the apps are deployed into the pods in their own namespace. So namespace are like logical grouping of resources inside Kubernetes. So namespace isolation becomes another control in this case. Again, these are not like exhaustive lists. There can be much more control depending upon the time you have and the scope you have mentioned at the time of the start of the assessment. So you have now created a component diagram. You have identified assets. You have identified the controls. The next step is to identify threat agents and trust zones. So if we can move to the next slide. What are threat agents? So threat agents are actors who are interested in harming the system in some way. Uh, in any system that you are trying to analyze, there will be some canonical threat agents and some context specific threat agents. So canonical threat agents are something which can be applied to any systems. There are 4 canonical threat agents. You can move to the next slide. One is unauthorized external threat agents. Those are like attackers over the internet. Authorized external user, those are like malicious user. Unauthorized external user, which are LAN-based attackers. And I'm sorry, unauthorized external user, which are the internet-based attackers. Authorized external are your malicious users. Unauthorized internal are LAN-based attackers, people on the same network. And authorized internal can be your system admins or DBAs. And again, depending upon the type of system you're analyzing, if the system is deployed on a cloud, it introduces another set of threat agents like the malicious cloud provider admin. If you are analyzing a mobile application which is running on the mobile device, so the rooted or jailbroken devices become another threat agents. So we'll try to identify some of the threat agents in the like hypothetical system. You can move to the next slide. So as you can see here, the red horned devils are kind of the threat agents. That's how we represent them. So as you can see, the 4 canonical threat agents here. One is the authorized external user, unauthorized external user, the authorized internal user, which are like the developers, and the unauthorized internal user, who can be like the LAN-based attackers. In addition to that, since this is a containerized environment and applications are deployed as pods inside the cluster, deploying a malicious pod inside the cluster introduces its own set of threats. You can potentially deploy a pod inside the cluster which can try to exfiltrate information out of the cluster or try to communicate with other applications running inside the cluster. So there are some context-specific threat agents that are introduced. The last part that we do in terms of modeling the application is identifying trust zones. So trust zones are essentially, you can think of it as boundaries under which the resources share the same level of trust. There can be various trust zones. One such trust zone can be the internet, which is the least amount of trust. We don't know who the people are on the internet. One such trust zone can be your network, the corporate network where you go and connect your devices to. Inside the corporate network, maybe you have a particular VPC that you create. So that can be another like trust zone. So these are some of the examples. And if you can go one slide back, as you can see here, we have represented the blue lines represent the trust zone. So there is the internet trust zone, there is the corporate network trust zone, there is the cluster trust zone, which is the Kubernetes cluster on which all the worker nodes and master nodes are running. Then there is the VPC trust zone. And inside the worker node, there is the namespaces, which can be treated as a trust zone. So depending upon the type of system you're trying to analyze, these trust zones can be identified. And move forward. So now that we have completed modeling the application, the next step is to perform the threat analysis. So as Eli mentioned earlier, most of the threat modeling approaches can be categorized into two, that is the checklist-based and non-checklist-based approaches. Synopsys' approach for performing threat modeling is a quasi-checklist-based approach. We have a checklist, but that checklist, we call it as the component security templates. So several subject matter expertise at Synopsys have created like a component security template, which we follow, which are like pre-baked checklist depending upon the type of system, technology, or component used, which enumerates all the potential risks, flaws that are associated with using that technology or into the system. So that is the checklist part, but it also leaves us room to do the brainstorming and thinking critically about what can go wrong if a particular component is used. So under the threat analysis, if you can move to the next slide, the first step is to identify components. So what are components? Components, like a whole system is composed of several subcomponents. So let's take an example of internet-based application. So some of the components can be like the mobile application can be one component. The web browser can be another component. The database server becomes another component. The API service can be another component. So different systems have different types of components. So it is important to identify the components. And then once you have identified a component, we perform the content security template is applied to each and every component to identify if there are any potential gaps or risks. So you can move to the next slide. So yeah, as I mentioned, the component security templates covers four major things. It covers the hardware and the software security of a component. It covers the data flow security, covers the data security, and lastly, the operational security. So what do all these mean? So when we say hardware or software security, what we are trying to analyze here is whether the application which is running on the hardware or the software on which the application is running can be trusted. Typically, these are not so relevant in the analysis if the system or the application is running in a trusted environment. Trusted environment can be a database running in like a protected data center. But it becomes very, very much important when you are trying to analyze the application which is running on an untrusted environment. For example, a mobile application running on a rooted or jailbroken device, a application running on IoT devices. So these hardware and software risk exists depending upon whether they are running. And in this step, we perform, like we apply the component security template to cover the hardware and the software part. Then once we have enumerated all the risks there, we apply the data flow security template. So what does data flow security template mean? It means that the ingress and the egress out of the component that we are analyzing, we check for whether the message, whether the data which is coming in, is it protected or not? Has it been modified? Whether the component is sending sensitive data to an untrusted third party. And if so, then we consider that as a risk. And once we have enumerated all the risks with respect to the data flow security, we move on to the data security, the data itself, where if it's a sensitive data, is the confidentiality or the integrity is maintained? If it's handling secrets, how are the secrets protected? Are there any risks associated with that? And lastly, once we have performed and enumerated all the data security risks and threats, we move on to the operational security. So here we consider all the operational security risks, such as privilege access management, logging, monitoring, how our backups performed, and any other risks which are related to like operations. Can move to the next slide. So how to divide a system into like components, like what is a component? As I mentioned, a system is composed of several subcomponents. A component can be a subnetwork, a virtual machine, a container, a process. Based on what type of system you are analyzing, these components can be identified. Move to the next slide. So let's take an example of a mobile application which is using web views and performing OAuth to get the access token. So the web view communicates with the authorization server and performs OAuth flow. And once the web view receives the access token from the authorization server, it passes that token to the native app, and then the native app can use that token to communicate to the application server or APIs. So how to divide this flow into components? So let's see. If you can move to the next slide. As you can see here, this native app can be one component. The web view portion of the app can be another component. The authorization server, which is issuing these tokens, can be one component, and the application server itself becomes another component. So now that we have tried to like divide the system into subcomponents, we have identified what are the different components. We'll try to apply the the component security template on these components. So if you can move to the next slide. So let's take an example of, let's take the native app. So as I said, we apply the hardware software security considerations. So are there any risks? Yes. Running an app onto a jailbroken or rooted device possesses its own threats and risks. So we can enumerate all the risks associated for running the native app onto the rooted device. This is where we'll consider all those risks and enumerate all those threats. Data flow security, the ingress, since it's the app is performing OAuth flow with maybe Pixie grants. So we'll identify if there are any risk associated with that OAuth implementation. The data security itself, like the app is handling or storing session tokens. So how are these tokens protected? Are they stored in like unencrypted? Are they stored in plain text? Are they written into logs? So all these risks will be identified and threats will be identified at this data security level. And lastly, the operational consideration, which essentially doesn't apply to a native app. And the same goes to the web view portion. So again, a web view is running inside application, and the application is able to be run on a jailbroken or rooted device, which possesses a risk of accessing the application sandbox. Data flow security, again, since we are performing OAuth flow using this app, so we'll try to identify if the OAuth implementation is correct. Is it following all the industry best practices? Are there any flaws there? We'll verify those. Since WebView is not storing any data, there essentially won't be any risks there. And operational security consideration doesn't apply to a WebView. Um, let's take another example wherein a user is trying to connect to a web server and these requests are balanced through F5 load balancer. So these three becomes like the major components. Let's try to apply the component security template to these components identified here. So you can go to the next. So let's take an example of the web server. And we'll apply the hardware and software security consideration, the component security template on the web server. As I mentioned, if the server or the application is running in a trusted environment, we typically don't consider that. And as a result, we are considering the web server is running in protected like data center. There are no hardware or security consideration or risks here. Data flow security, whether the server is available over or providing or supporting TLS security, the channel encryption or not, so that all the data is encrypted in transit. So we'll look into those risks there. The data security, what if the server is managing or storing some secrets to connect to maybe a database, right, is storing some secrets or private keys to issue token or sign tokens. How are those secrets and keys protected at the server? We'll take into consideration that. And then lastly, the operational security, whether we are using the latest patched version of the server or not, whether there are any vulnerabilities that are published with respect to the particular version. Are we performing logging? Are we performing like audit logs? Or is somebody monitoring those logs? And all those things will be taken into account at this step, and all those threats and risks will be enumerated with respect to the web server. And the same applies to the F5 load balancer. That is how we enumerate all the threats and risks when we identify different components and applying all these different security templates that we have pre-baked and used that we use in our analysis. So if we move to the next slide, now that we know how to divide a system into components, so there is no scientific method of dividing system into components, but there can be different ways. You can abstract components which are running inside the same trust boundary. You can abstract components into one single component which performs similar types of actions. So since we looked at the examples which are like mostly client server based, but what if there is a microservice based architecture where like there are 100 microservices running in the backend, which is front ended by like an API gateway. So does that mean we have to represent each and every service on our diagram? No, you can essentially abstract there can be two major components here. One can be the API gateway, and another component can be your microservices mesh. Additionally, if you feel there is some particular microservice which is performing critical function, you can represent that as a separate component to identify any threats, risks, and attacks there. So this can be applied to any level of granularity, depending upon how much time you have and how much have you scoped the assessment. So if you can move to the next slide. So now that we have identified we have created the diagram, we have identified assets, controls, threat agents, and we have enumerated all the risks based on the type of the system. It is time to prioritize those risks, and Ellie can talk you through how we prioritize the threats.
Thank you, Biplav. We do have one question so far, but if anybody has any other questions, please type them. So one of the questions is, do you have any recommendations for staying in scope and not going beyond the guardrails?
Go ahead.
So
Go ahead.
You want to take that? Okay. So a couple of things. One, when you're looking at the system that you want to analyze, chances are it communicates with many different other systems, either internally within the organization or externally. So the number one step is to draw a box about what is in scope, what are you going to care about, and what you're not going to care about. So usually we do that by drawing literally a box on an overall system diagram and saying everything inside the box is in scope, and all the communications from that box to the out to other components is in scope. But we're not going to go beyond that. So that would be the number one step. And number two, and that comes with experience, is to think through on a high level the complexity of a system and putting a time box around it, where you think, okay, this is enough time for us to do a thorough analysis, and further analysis will provide diminishing returns. So that's how we usually do that. Viplav, do you want to add anything to
No,
that?
I believe, yeah, that is how we do. It's very important to define the scope before you start an assessment because the scope determines how much level of effort you will be spending upon. So yeah, it is an important step to define the scope very clearly. Yeah.
Okay. So the last step in our approach is thinking about how do you actually prioritize the steps so you can actually do something about them, right? Which is, in my opinion, is the most important part. And to figure out what to do, you need to know the priorities. And the priority is based on two factors, likelihood and impact. So likelihood is the first one we look at. I know some people like to think about the motivation of the attackers. That's not what we look at because, to be honest, we don't know what really motivates the attackers or what doesn't motivate them. So the underlying assumption that we make is that the attackers are indeed motivated. So they want to attack the system and they want to exploit that particular threat. So once we make that assumption that people actually want to exploit you, then we think about how likely is that they're going to be able to succeed at that exploit. And their success will depend on a number of factors. Are the attacks already occurring in the wild? So if these kind of attacks are already happening, there's more likely that there are available rootkits, available exploit tools out there that people can reuse, right? What kind of access do they need? Is this a threat agent that's unauthorized threat agents from the outside or inside that can execute those threats? So that will matter. Another factor is how sophisticated you have to be. Is that something that you can download a script of the web and execute, or do you really need to start doing reverse engineering and building custom exploits? And then you want to think through other controls that you have within your system to mitigate the risk. And important thing to think through that these controls may not be just technical controls, preventative controls. They could be other controls as well from a procedural perspective, right? They could be procedural controls in place. Okay. And then the next one is impact. So you want to think about what the impact will be on the organization if this threat is actually exploited. And there is legal impact and business. And to truly understand the impact, as a consultant, it's very hard. Well, I would say it's actually impossible to do without truly understanding the business. So what that means is, one, when you build the model of a system you're analyzing, you actually need to talk to the people who build it. You need to talk to architects, you need to talk to developers, you need to talk to operational and database guys who run it to understand what the model looks like. So if you want to truly understand what the impact is, you need to talk to people who will actually be impacted, which is business, because they will be able to inform you on the impact that matters to them. And you're not going to look at it from an impact from a technical perspective, but you're going to truly need to think of it from a business perspective. So once you have those two factors, you can think about how you prioritize the things that you identified and what you do with them. Some of those things you can prioritize for pen testers to pen test. Some of those things can go back into developing design patterns for non-functional security requirements. Okay. Okay. So moving on, there's, as we said, there is the approach that we have is based on a checklist, but that's not the only thing that we do. There is a creative component. So one of the tools that you can use to to think creatively how to attack the system is to use something called attack trees, right? And attack trees are meant to help you think through how to exploit, right? And attack trees have root node, child nodes, and leaves, right? Root node is your goal and objective as an attacker. So first you want to define what are you trying to achieve as an attacker. That's your goal and objective. And child nodes are refinements of the goal, right? So what kind of things do you need to do to actually achieve your goal? And leave nodes are the actual attacks, right? And these are the actual threats. And sometimes the leaf nodes have or and, meaning you either can do one or the other, or sometimes you need to do both and to achieve your goal. So here's an example of an attack tree that was introduced by Bruce in 1999. And that is, how do you open a safe? And so what you see at the top, right, is the main node at the top, which is your goal, open a safe. And then you have a few subnodes. What are the different ways that you can do it? You can pick a lock, you can learn a combo, you can cut it open, you can install it properly, improperly. So, and you notice there are letters I and P. One is impossible, one is possible. So when you come to a leaf node, such as pick a lock, maybe in that particular situation, based on the sophistication that you have, you may say that's impossible. So you stop your analysis. But then on the other one, cut open the safe, it is possible. So now that's a threat that you can think through. But then you also see there's things like learn the combo, which means you're going to learn what is the secret to open the safe. And that one in its own could be multiple ways you can do it. You can find it somewhere, or you can get a combo from the target. Maybe you can phish them. Then you can threaten them, you can blackmail them, phish them, bribe them, etc. Or eavesdrop them. And that gives you an example of an end. To eavesdrop, you need to both listen to conversation and get the target to actually state it. So that's an example of an attack tree where now that you have a model of a system, you understand the threats, the controls, the assets, you understand the business and what the business cares about, you can start using this exercise to come up with attack trees so that you can easily communicate that to business of how would somebody actually exploit, right? And the impossible and possible comes out of your analysis, right? So in real life, when you identify certain threats, you will say whether that's possible or unlikely based on the analysis that you've done previously to identify controls within the system. And then the last slide that we have is now if you have a threat, right? How do you represent it so it makes sense to people who's going to consume it, right? And one of the ways that you can represent it is through something we call traceability matrix, where you basically say a threat agent is trying to compromise some sort of an asset using this kind of attack, interacting with that asset over a certain attack surface with a certain attack goal, because there's always has to be a goal. And then if they're successful, the impact would be as follows. And here's what you can do to mitigate this threat, or actions you can take either pre or post exploitation. Okay, so I think that's our presentation. I wanted to quickly check to see if there are any questions. I see there is one more question. And it says, is there a way to handle zero-day exploits in threat modeling? Or is that handled by something like a pen test? Viplab, do you want to take this one? You could be on mute. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. So threat modeling essentially brings out like the architectural gaps and any risk on the implementation. When we talk about zero-day exploit, those are more of a implementation level bugs that an attacker exploits. I don't think that would be handled by a threat model. What are your thoughts?
So yeah, I mean, 0 days is, think about it, somebody found a new way to exploit the system that nobody knew about before, right? Um, so how can you find them? You either wait and for some researchers or bad guys to find them, or you do your own analysis, right? Most organizations that we work with, they don't do their own analysis to find their own 0 days. Some do, and the organizations who heavily rely on certain technology stacks or technologies do their own research to find their own 0 days. But most organizations don't look for their own 0 days, and they rely on the threat intelligence that they gather through various channels to understand how to deal with them, right? And as Viplav said, in many cases, 0 days are not necessarily due to design or architectural flaw. It could be due to an implementation flaw. And threat modeling, being a paper exercise, is not a way to identify implementation flaws. For that, you can look at things like pen testing, security testing, static analysis, and other defect discovery techniques that actually look at the implementation itself, either in a static form or dynamic form, to identify these kind of issues. So I believe there are no more questions in the channel. So if there are no more questions, then I think we're all set. Are there any questions from anybody from OWASP?
Oh, I was on mute that whole time. Nope, nothing from me. Anybody else?
Nope.
No, I think we're good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Eli and Viplav. Yeah, I guess we'll take a 10-minute break and we'll start the next presentation at 7:42. Thanks again, Eli and Viplav.
Thank you, guys. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Hey everybody, there we go. Just give us a minute to get sorted out and we will begin. All right, Connor, you ready?
All right. All good on my side.
Awesome, the floor is yours.
Fantastic, thank you. So hopefully everyone can hear and see me okay. I'm going to be monitoring the comments in the chat there. So if you have a question or anything, feel free to post it and I'll try and respond to it whenever there's a pause. With that being said, let's dive straight in. So we're here today to talk about designing a security champions program from scratch. My name's Connor. A little bit about myself. I'm a security engineer specializing in the application security space. I currently work at Wealthsimple, and my background includes extensive experience developing distributed full stack web applications, project management. I've done project lead stuff, coach stuff, mentoring stuff. Really, I love working with teams. And so security champions came very naturally to me as something I wanted to be involved with. Some quick caveats before we get underway. This talk represents my own thoughts and opinions. It is not my employer's presentation. I'm not going to claim to be the definitive expert in this space. I really just want to share what I've learned and some of the pain points I've experienced. And finally, I'm not a genius, and a almost hurtful number of people would be willing to confirm that for you. So why this presentation, and what am I trying to do a little differently here? I created this talk because when I first started trying to build a security champions program, I felt like there were a lot of materials that focused on all these benefits you got from a security champions program and didn't really dive into the minutia of trying to build one and the pain that can come along with that. So I'm here to share everything I did wrong so that hopefully you don't have to. Quick overview of the presentation. We're going to start with an initial concept, how to manage a pitch. So when you're presenting this to hopefully a new organization that has never had a security champions program before, how do you sell it? What do you need in order to launch successfully? Lots of things that are evident and some things that maybe aren't. What does a meeting look like? So a meeting for us is one of the methods we have of reinforcing this security champions program. And what does training look like? How do we turn developers into security champions? What do we do to measure the success of a program after the fact? And what did we learn along the way? So where are we at right now? So with the current Security Champions program, we launched about 4 months back, and we're preparing for a new cohort in about 2 months. We're collecting feedback as we go, but I want to be very transparent here and say that this is not some 20-year-old program. The pain is fresh in my mind, and we're learning as we go, and I want to catch you up on where I've been and what we're doing now. So I'll start with a question. In the average organization, what is the ratio of developers to security professionals? And reflect on both the organization you're in right now and maybe organizations you work with or where your colleagues are at. And I think the ratio tends to come out to about 100 to 1. I found a couple of links that reference this. My experience has been comparable. Obviously, there's some shift depending on industry and how important privacy and security may be. With that being said, I think a security champions program is the single best vehicle you're going to have for creating that security culture in an organization. And we'll get into what I mean by security culture, but lots of people probably already have their own definition. When I say it, I want to mean that we're going to emphasize the idea that everyone is responsible for security. Yes, the security team is accountable, but we are all members of the organization. We are all responsible for our clients' trust, our team members' trust, our stakeholders and shareholders' trust. So let's start with the initial concept. What is a security champion? What is a program? What does that all look like? And how do you start building out what you're going to need before you launch? I'm going to say that the first thing you're going to want to do is define the problem. We need to start by finding the pain points we want to address. Some good examples that we talked about were, how do we build a security culture? Yes, right now we have good people doing smart things, but how do you take a structured approach and how do you actually define what a security culture means in your own organization? And the second pain point that I want to talk about is how do you scale security effectively? Based on that earlier slide where we're talking about a ratio of 100 to 1, we are always going to be a minuscule portion of the total engineering org and the total organization as a whole. And so really security champions become this method that we can scale our influence and our outreach way beyond the size of our team. The next thing you're going to want to do is define success. So you know what the pain is, and then you need to know what you're aiming for. Be sure to pick SMART goals. Pick a small, concrete number of engineers to complete the initial training by a specific date. Determine how you're going to measure their impact. Some suggestions are qualitative or quantitative. Are you going to be measuring how much training they did? Are you going to be measuring decrease in initial bugs? And we'll talk about why that may not be a good metric in a little bit. Or are there specific things that you're hoping they will contribute to, specific security projects or presentations or outreach events or what have you? I mentioned SMART goals, and hopefully this is not something new, but it's worth kind of bringing back. SMART goal is something that is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. You need to know what you want to do, how it's going to be measured when it's done, making sure that it's reasonable and related to those pain points we discussed earlier, and also setting a deadline for it instead of having this nebulous someday kind of attitude to it. Sometimes you'll see SMART goals with achievable replaced by assignable. I also like this method in that is it within one individual's power to do is a good way of framing, is it reasonable? Is it sized appropriately? If it's going to take a team of 10, then you may have to break apart this goal. So let's define the role. This is where we start to get into what we're trying to do with security champions. We know the pain, we know what we're aiming for, and now we're trying to define who's going to fill that space to accomplish these goals. First and foremost, a security champion is enthusiastic. From my point of view, this is the defining characteristic. It is someone who cares really deeply about security. A security champion is going to be someone who's empowered to make security decisions. They're going to, have certain boundaries on when they can or can't make decisions. And you'll probably want to set up early about where they can or can't make a decision call without consulting your team. The model I tend to refer to is almost like the old West model of a sheriff and sheriff deputies. Sometimes they are longstanding members of the team who are given power over their own application space. Sometimes they are gathered to deal with something. So I've seen that used successfully where we have said, there's something that we need to look at, and we're going to gather a large group of security champions and have them assist us in processing or analyzing. So there's a lot of different ways that you can define this role, and setting up the expectations early are going to help you when you come to the pitch. Okay, now what? If you're watching this talk, I'm going to assume that you don't really need the hard sell. You've probably wondered how you can shift an entire security organization from a startup to an enterprise. And I think the best way that I would approach this is we're going to zoom in for a second and follow just one method and one way to approach this. So I want you to meet Alice. Alice is a hypothetical character. She recently started a new job at a rapidly growing startup. Her director has asked her to take charge in creating a security culture to help in identifying security vulnerabilities earlier. She's excited about this opportunity, but is a bit hesitant because she is new to the organization. So there's a couple of things that we should pull out of this right away. One, we know what some of the goals are going to be. It's creating that security culture and identifying vulnerabilities to the left of the software development lifecycle. And we know what some of the risks are. It's someone who's new to the organization, may not know the politics that are going on, may not know the stakeholders, and now has this uphill battle almost of convincing people to buy in to something novel and something that is frankly going to take time. So we're going to follow Alice and see some of the things that I wish I had done the first time. So we're going to start with a story. Her early efforts suffered because department heads and developers just weren't buying in. Some of the feedback that I've seen personally have been things like, I'm just not sure how I'll have time for this from developers, engineering managers being like, I appreciate that security is important, but I need to ship and I'm being measured on features. And human resources talking about, well, if we make this voluntary, we've had poor turnout. If we make it mandatory, we risk alienating people. And sort of like, how do you manage a training program? Obviously, these quotes are just for illustrative purposes only. I'm not directly quoting anyone, but these are based off of multiple rounds of interviews I've conducted as we were trying to implement security champions programs. So remember what you're pitching. A security champions program is the process by which you will attempt to create a single security champion for engineering team, who will then be empowered to make security decisions on this team. This was the definitions we chose. Yours may be slightly different, but remember that the program is the vehicle by which you'll be delivering these new security champions. You'll be cultivating these champions through learning modules, recurring meetings, team events, and project work. There's lots of different ways to help turn a developer into a security champion, or turn any member of your organization into a security champion. We're going to look at just a few of the tools that we have at our disposal. I do want to mention, because I seem to have skipped it earlier in this conversation, I keep saying developer. I'm very much focused on the security champions program for developers, but that's not to say that there is an opportunity to do security champions for non-technical people as well. So how do you manage this pitch? Well, there's a couple of different levers you can pull on. One of the ones that I like is the power of association. Can you connect this program to something people already care about? Are they already passionate about it? For managers, this is a really good one, because we were able to connect to their goal of delivering stuff faster. We're able to say, hey, I hear you on trying to deliver. Right now, security is this last mile problem, and we hold up releases. If you help us and we can get some security champions, we can start identifying problems earlier. So further left on the software development lifecycle, further left on that CI/CD pipeline. And hopefully we can help speed up your delivery time by empowering your team to make choices for themselves. This kind of resonated well. We were able to relate to the pain they were already experiencing. And it's a good sell. So when you're pitching, you're gonna have to switch your hat from a security professional almost to like sales and marketing. It is now your job to convince. Self-interest is an interesting one. It's one that people tend to bring up when we talk about how to convince people to do something. Swag or promotion opportunities or that sort of thing. One interesting point here is this kind of backfired a little bit. I don't want to say it backfired. Maybe it fell flat. We were trying to appeal to self-interest for developers, saying, hey, do this and it'll help you at your next promotion, or do this and it'll look great on your resume. And especially with senior engineers who maybe are further along in their career going, well, why do I need this to pad my resume? I'm already very accomplished. I could certainly understand that sort of response. And I think the reason it fell flat is we made assumptions about what would motivate them, and they took it, or not they took it. It's possible to infer that we were looking at selfish motivations, and that's not a very nice thing to say about someone. So you have to be very careful with self-interest in that you want to appeal to a legitimate pain point without offending their identity. For instance, human resources was a good one, because we were able to say, listen, we want to work with you on this, and we're willing to do the early lifting, and we're willing to help sort out the nomination process and the meetings process. And so that was work that we could take off their plates, because we're saying we're willing to do this. And we're willing to create templates and help. And if there is success, we're happy to share them and reuse them. So that self-interest is a little more conducive to selling. So what did work with developers was appealing to identity. Before making a decision, people tend to reflect on, what would someone like me do in this situation? This means that you can actually focus on intangible things related to it. So one really interesting thing I found when I did the post interview, so we had selected our security champions, is every single person who came to the security champions program, not one really mentioned promotions or resume padding or anything like that. Every single one of them, though, mentioned wanting to do the right thing on their team or caring about the quality of the product. I think that there's something here where if you can equate security to code quality, you can tie it into something developers are very passionate about and are already thinking about. And so this worked really well for us. And I've seen it work in other cases and other sales type roles I've had to play. If you're wondering where these three levers came from, I can't recommend enough MageStick by Chip and Dan Heath. It is excellent, and it goes into far more detail than what I'm providing right here. In fact, this whole presentation is based off of their templates. So big shout out for that piece of literature. So let's come back to Alice. With these few minor tweaks, Alice got the pitch down and now is getting ready to launch this program. So we've defined our problems, we've defined our success, we have defined the role. Those are the three definitions we need to nail down. We got the buy-in from stakeholders, and now we're starting to get ready to launch the program for the first time. What does a launch actually include? So one of the most important buy-ins you're going to have to get is management. This is sort of an aside, but I want to bring it up. When we talk to developers, the fear of not having enough time is a legitimate one. Developers are really busy, and most of them are not going to feel comfortable committing to significant after hours. They already have a long day. What we did is we got buy-in from our management layer to spend about 10% of their time on security champions work. And this incorporates all of the recurring meetings, the events, the project work, and we're flexible. So we do have to say if there are things on your team, those can take priority in this case. So have you secured stakeholder support? Did you get buy-in from the developers? Did you get buy-in from engineering managers? Do you need to go higher? Do you need to go to the CTO? Did you get buy-in from HR? Those tend to be the stakeholders that I've encountered. Did you secure a budget? So you can do a lot with very little for a Security Champions program. But when we come to the training and meeting and eventing sections, we'll talk a bit more about when you may want to do a buy versus build kind of decision. And then in that case, you will, of course, need to secure the budget ahead of time. Have you completed the definition section? So right at the beginning, when we talked about the initial concept, it's really important that you nail those down because they are going to be things that we reflect on as we go forward. Did you build excitement? Did you launch this program out of the blue, or did you actually talk to developers and managers and start to get their buy-in months in advance? Did you establish where this is going to happen, a recurring meeting room, a Slack channel, Microsoft Teams channel, whatever your company is currently using to communicate? And did you get security champions? So we're going to talk a bit more about how we selected our champions, but before you launch, you do need to go out and recruit. Something that we're going to cover in just a moment, locking down a training provider and setting up recurring meetings for security champions, as well as determining what the structure of a meeting looks like. So building excitement, kind of a step that I think it's skipped sometimes and can be accomplished a lot of different ways. One of the ways I like to do is like this recurring newsletter from security and workshops where you engage with your organization's community. So a pretty basic layout for a newsletter that we use when we're trying to build excitement looks a little something like this. So it starts with the call to action. If you're familiar with print media, you've probably heard the "don't bury the lead" line before. So always start with what you want people to do. If you're building a security champions program, start with like, here's how you apply, here's when you need to apply by, and give links or instructions on what they need to do to apply. After that, I like to dive into what I call story time. Tell a story about a recent security incident, how it was prevented, and specifically highlight the role that non-security teams played, especially if it was a significant role. I think the idea that security tackles these problems in isolation really needs to be set aside, and story time is an excellent opportunity to really demonstrate that value we were discussing earlier, where we said security is everyone's responsibility. And this is just that concrete proof of it. After story time, it's worth doing a kudos again to highlight maybe a specific non-security person who played a pivotal role. If you can offer a tangible reward, some kind of Uber Eats card, I think this self-interest works best because it's not asked for. It's just a surprise and a pleasant one at that. Last but not least, certainly, is do the math. You want to end these sort of things by being very transparent with your KPIs. your key performance indicators and really show where you're doing well and what the opportunities for improvement are. If done ahead of time, can also help you make the case for the security champions. When you come to leadership and say, I think this is a good program, you can talk about delays in shipping products, or you can talk about the ability to build security in earlier in the pipeline. So this is an opportunity to lay the foundation for the work you want to do at the pitch. Nominations. So when we talked about selecting security champions, it's worth reflecting on the role that enthusiasm plays. And in that regard, I think nominations fit this very nicely. It forces almost a filter for someone who cares enough to go out and get one other person to bring them forward. So for us, we asked people to say, go to their team leads and receive a nomination. So tips for selecting candidates, we already talked a bit about nomination and how that plays into the primary characteristic of a security champion being enthusiasm. Scarcity. So there are two things here. One, you want to start with a small group so that you can be iterative in your approach. So small groups, defined periods of time. I think trying to roll out to 100, 200, 300 developers all at once, if it's your first time, is going to be tricky. And the second thing to scarcity is there's something appealing about being able to get one of the last spots. Nominations make sense for this because then you can say we are accepting 6 nominations for the first cohort and we will revisit this again in X number of months. And that's the time sensitive aspect right there. So you want to highlight again, oh, apologies, this is a typo. So for time sensitive, you want to highlight when the end date is, and you want to encourage people to apply by a certain date. In this way, you can get those responses in so that you can start your planning. And there's also nothing to say that if you don't get enough applications in by the first time, you can just extend it a week, but do put a concrete deadline on it. So coming back to Alice, Alice had built this great checklist, made sure that all her bases were covered. She just needed to lock down a training provider and establish a meeting template. Remember that the launch really is just getting all your ducks in a row and setting up for these meetings, the associated training, and the initial project work. Okay, so what does a meeting look like? This is probably the primary vehicle that we use to drive the educational component of being a security champion, as well as to ensure that we are regularly touching base with our security champions. The cadence is about an hour a week, taken from that 10% time. So I see we have a question coming in, and thank you. So the question was, do you have any guide or recommendation for number of security champions for engineering development teams? Initially, I like the idea of at least 1 per team. It provides a bit of cross-functional support where you pull in expertise from the different domains within your organization. So depending on how those engineering teams are, you may need to massage that, but you're trying to get a good cross-section both in skill level, so junior, senior, as well as technology stack. So if they're programming back-end, front-end, or if they're doing something else, you really want to try and pick a number that is going to give you a representative cross-section. 1 per team seems to work fairly well. Hopefully that answers your question. So what does the meeting look like? Well, this is the general structure that we use. We start with a welcome and a recap. We go through a question of the day. We go through a book club style. Then we end with a bit of project work and conclusion. It's a lot jam-packed into an hour. So let's walk through quickly how we kind of work this out. Before we do that, some quick meeting tips. Something that I've done or picked up over a number of years running meetings: pay attention, make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak. There are people who are talkers and there are people who are quieter. What you want to make sure is that everyone has an opportunity to feel heard. When I brought this point up to my partner, they said instantly, they're like, if you force someone to speak, if you force me to speak, I would hate you. So do be aware that you can't make someone talk. You just want to make sure that they feel safe and have the opportunity to. Be comfortable with awkward silence. You will get a lot more if you wait for people to answer. So sit there, wait a bit, wait a bit more. If you're uncomfortable, wait even just a little bit longer. That tends to produce some interesting results, even if it is just uncomfortable laughter. And one thing that I will say again and again and again is get a separate note taker for each session. This was something I failed to do when I first started trying to run these things, and it bit me in the behind. So definitely something you want to make sure you have. It can be a volunteer, it can be rotating, it can be however you want to do it. Just make sure someone is taking notes. If you're running a meeting, I find it very hard to also be the person taking the notes. So welcome and recap. Usually I like to start, get everyone settled, 5-minute grace period for people to sort of come in and sit down. Well, back when we had physical meetings, but for joining the Zoom meeting, 5 minutes is also nice. Look back through your meeting notes. If you have that note taker that I mentioned, this should be really easy. You can review what was covered in the last session in point form. And if there were specific things that you wanted to call out or announcements, this is a good opportunity as well. We do a question of the day. So we like to follow the recap with a question meant to foster a conversation around security and create connections in the group. Examples of good questions that we ask are, have you ever personally been hacked? How does your opinion of a company change when there is, a public disclosure of breach? These sort of things tend to foster conversations on a personal level between the team members. And I think this plays a dual role. One, it's trying to build that interest in security, but two, the real benefit of a security champions program is that networking effect. You have people sharing information, sharing ideas, techniques, backing each other up, and a little forced intimacy is probably a good thing. What I recommend is split the group into even breakout rooms and give them 5 to 10 minutes to discuss, depending on the type of question. If it's a longer one, definitely err on the side of 10 minutes. It's worth taking the time to do this right. As far as the group size, between 2 and 4 people per room, depending on how many champions you have, seems to work fairly well. Book club. So this is what we call this section. It is when we take the total number of learning modules that were assigned last week, and we literally do book club style discussion. We have a list of questions prepared ahead of time where we review what the module covered, if there were surprising things, if there were things that we believe we can apply, if there are things we disagree with. This is also a good point of discussion. I do recommend that you have the questions prepared ahead of time because it's very tough to make them up on the fly. Project work. One of the big advantages of a security champions program is that you have this cross section of expertise. So as I mentioned before, when you're trying to build these nominations, 1 per team, tends to work. And the reason we want that is that cross section really gives you access to a lot of different skill sets. You know, I'm a security engineer and I have a particular skill set, but I will never fully understand or grasp the domain of, say, like a database administrator or systems engineering or site reliability engineering. And so this cross section really gives you a better viewpoint. And the project is a great way to take advantage of this because you can select a project that'll benefit from this. So whether this is improving each team's deployment pipeline, if this is having them prepare from a provided template a security presentation for their own teams, really just trying to select a project that is going to take advantage of this. So tips for selecting a project. 1, start with pain points. You're gonna crowdsource. This is from the security team, this is from the broader org. What sucks right now? I find that if you ask people what's bothering them, the first time you might not get something, but if you allow anonymous collection, or if you just give them an opportunity to gripe a little bit, it goes over well. So then you're going to prioritize, have the security team assess these pain points, prioritize them to provide a group of no more than a dozen hand-selected pain points. You want problems that are going to give you a good return on investment and don't require initially a ton of security expertise. So remember the target of this. You want to select something where the benefits are going to be apparent within like a 1 to 3 month window. And you're going to want something that isn't going to require you to get someone to an expert level on the security discipline before they can contribute. And again, you probably don't want to select more than maybe a dozen of these points. Use weighted voting. So once you take these to your security champions, I prefer to do weighted voting over standardized or standard voting. I find that people either care really deeply about what they want to do, or they could go to a couple of different ones just as easy. Give them 3 votes, let them distribute it across the 12 that you've selected, and then act as the tiebreaker. So if you end up with a 3-way tie, it's okay to step back and be like, okay, what's going to give me the best return on investment? And what do I believe is reasonable for us to accomplish? Go back and reflect on your SMART goals. Again, remembering that the strength of the group is that you have a cross-section of the company and a varied skill set. Conclusion. So we wrap up our sessions by giving kudos to your security champions where earned. So either for progress through the learning modules or for their work on the project. We want to thank everyone for their time and iterate again those action items that we want. So that's what learning modules do we expect? What progress on the projects do we expect? Are there events or other things that are coming up that they need to be aware of? Okay, so we talked a bit about the book club, and that comes from these learning modules that our security champions are doing. So I'm not going to pitch you a particular platform, but I do want to bring up a few points that I think are worth considering when you're selecting your platform. One thing that I really love is manageable time commitments. So developers are really busy, as are we. Making sure that the modules are small enough that they can consume them between a meeting plays really nicely. So something that's no more than 20 minutes works well. Be prepared to have a mix of learning styles. Hands-on tends to work particularly well. If you can have them correcting code or exploiting something, this plays right into the natural curiosity and builder owner nature. Something for you as the program administrator that you're going to want is advanced monitoring tools. Again, put on your marketing hat and think of it as a funnel of where are people in my training program losing interest, where are they dropping off? Tools that provide you visibility into how your developers are doing. Are they advancing through the modules? Are they stopping at a particular module? These sort of things really help in the administration of a program. Last, it almost feels silly to say it, but check the quality of the content. Sit down, review half a dozen or a dozen modules. Do you agree with them on what the industry best practices are? Are they bringing credibility to it by selecting security experts that have a reasonable degree of expertise in the field? Just a quick spot check through the catalog is a good call. Not everyone will like this, but it is something I particularly enjoy, which is a competitive nature to a learning module or to a learning platform, allowing developers to compete against each other with a leaderboard or even just like a kudos wall where you pass out for people completing certain milestones. It does work for me, and I think it works for a lot of people. This is something you'll have to reflect, though, on the values of your own organization to see if it meshes well with your culture. One thing that is an excellent learning opportunity is learning from real life. If you can discuss a real vulnerability or a real incident in your own organization, it really helps drive home the point where developers can see themselves in the issue or can relate to it. So questions of the day help spark previous events they might have dealt with, but learning from real life is a chance to learn from fresh, real, top of the mind type of stuff. If you can't do a real event, just like the simulations, throw in a few events for good measure. I personally have had really good luck getting developers interested in security after pairing with them during a CTF. In fact, that's how I got started in security from a software developer position, is I did a CTF and thoroughly enjoyed it. People who build things, if you can show them how to break them, it's a very natural turning point. So I mentioned this earlier, but again, we started with engineers. This means that the type of trainings and events that we picked were based around our goals for an engineer and for the engineering organization. There is nothing to stop you from picking goals and training platforms that would accommodate a training plan for the broader org. That's actually something that we're looking at right now, based on the lessons that we're learning with this first initial small cohort. or expanding to try this similar type of program with non-technical groups. So for those curious around that, social engineering, password hygiene, personal security, these are always really good topics that I think would be good to cover with the broader org. So we're coming back to Alice there. After locking in the meeting format and a training provider, Alice is ready to go. Security Champions program launched with initial cohort of 6. We do a pulse check every few months, and the first group is established, and we're looking to launch the second cohort. So how do you measure success after the fact? Well, we're currently looking at this, I'll be honest. We're about to launch the second cohort, and we're collecting all this feedback. But in general, the ways that we're trying to evaluate it are quantitative measures, like counting the number of vulnerabilities identified by champions and the number of incidents month to month, and qualitative things like exit interviews and interviews with engineering managers. One thing that was told to me, and so I will share it again, is to be wary with these numbers, especially the ones around identifying the number of vulnerabilities or incidents or any sort of thing like that. When you increase visibility, you tend to find more. So initially, we do expect to see a sort of upswing in this, and that's expected and actually good news, because it means that we are addressing and finding and detecting all of these sort of things. So what did we learn on the way? This is kind of a potpourri of things I've found as we implemented this program, or other things that I found from running teams and meetings and that sort of thing. And so it's just collected here because it didn't seem to fit anywhere else. It's hard to do this alone. If you can, bring in support from other members of your team, or tap security champions to become directly responsible individuals for certain portions. Maybe have someone responsible for deliverables in the project, or have someone responsible for the note-taking. But it is very tough to do this alone. Have some backup lessons planned. One thing that bit me early, we all get busy. Our day-to-days are always crazy. And so there are definitely going to be days where you cannot join that recurring meeting, and having a pre-canned question of the day, discussion points, that sort of thing means that it's very easy for someone else to step in and act as the facilitator for this. Get a note taker. I said it once, I'll say it again. We didn't start with one, and I regret that. It really does prevent you from repeating yourself, as I just did. And one more point is, it's tempting to share things before they are ready. When we're talking about building excitement, it's tempting to say, oh, we've got this event coming up, or we've got this training platform we're looking to acquire. Try to resist the urge to share before you've actually locked it down. That initial swing in enthusiasm, if you have unforeseen delays, and there are always unforeseen delays, it turns to bitterness very quickly. And everyone's too polite to say it, but you know, and you can feel it when it's like, we missed on our promise here. One sort of thought that I want to add that's not on this slide, just around security champions as well, is, and now I'm having a brain fart, so I will come back to it in a second. I'm nearing the end of my presentation here, so I'll close by saying we are hiring at Wealthsimple. We're looking for a fraud engineer, another security engineer on my team in the application space, and a senior security engineer in the application space as well. If this is something that you're interested in, you're more than welcome to apply directly through our job board, or if you have questions, you can reach out to me. I'm available on LinkedIn as Connor McKinnon. Yeah, so I'll pause here and ask if we have any questions from the group. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Connor, for the presentation.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. First time giving a remote presentation.
Yeah, it was great. Is there any other comments or questions in the chat here?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. It looks like Galiv's asking, how do you help security champions navigate the conflict of interest between security and speed of feature completion, empowerment, and escalation? And then have you encountered security champions erring on the side of insecurity in favor of not rocking the boat?
A really good question. It's a tough sell. I think we actually did see a shift in opinion where when we started arming security champions with talking points on how to discuss with their team, we saw not necessarily that they weren't ready to rock the boat the first time, but that they were better equipped to rock the boat. It might be the best way of putting this. In general, we saw people who were very passionate about securing the product, but making that argument to feature or product or engineering managers, it was providing them with the tools that they needed to make that discussion around risk and likelihood. So yeah, I wouldn't say that we had people erring on the side of insecurity, but it certainly helped when we were able to arm them with techniques to discuss with their team.
Any specific examples that you could share?
Sure, yeah. So one slide, I don't have it in this deck, and I probably should have included it, is I really love to show the cost of fixing a vulnerability as you move through the CI/CD pipeline. If you fix something in a requirement stage, it's like $0. It's free. You fix this design architectural flaw. And we just had a great session on threat modeling. So if you're using threat modeling to do your architecture stage, you can fix these things for free. When we talk to security champions and we're giving them talking points for when they want to fix things, the two things we can talk about is helping them have that conversation earlier so they can identify with their managers when there's going to be a problem earlier in the pipeline. And then as well as talking about the impact that they see coming for client trust. So yes, we can release this, but how would you feel with, or are you comfortable with this outcome? Finally, there is a not so friendly trick, but if you are getting some pushback, it's always worth having someone sign off. Hey, are you personally willing to put your name beside this security finding and saying that you're not going to make this call? I don't think I've seen many people who are willing to put their name beside it at the end of the day. So some of those tricks around discussing around the cost of fixing something down the pipeline, the loss of client trust, and actually physically putting a name to assign risk acceptance. Those tend to go over okay, but I'd love to hear from the community if they have their own favorite tricks for having these conversations as well.
What are some of the top projects that you guys decided were of interest to you?
Sure. So I think one that every company can look at fairly well is the DevSecOps pipeline. Security champions, because they represent this cross-section of multiple teams, have really good insight into the tooling and automation and processes they use in their own integration and deployment pipeline. So having them be involved in the conversation around DevSecOps tooling really pays off well, because you can see that they get involved earlier and point out things, point out some really interesting things when you're trying to implement. So two that I've had experience coming from developers is idempotency around changes. So developers caught that certain security tooling would flag changes that were not related to the changes that they made. So their PR is getting blocked, but it's not related to any change they made. It's just because there has been something identified in a subcomponent or something like that. So reflecting on how tools block or don't block, developers have a really good stake in that, as well as being able to show return on investment. Do we block at this stage in the pipeline for this level of severity, or do we block earlier? Developers have really good insight into the tools that will have an impact on their ability to deliver. And so they're great stakeholders in the DevSecOps pipeline. So that was one project that went really well.
Okay, thanks. Shall we just give people a couple minutes in case they have other questions? Anything else that you would add to the talk now that you've had a chance to give it and maybe reflect on the content that's here? Like, what would you have talked about, for example, if you had more time?
I wish I could recall the brain lapse I had right in the final section there. I think what I would do for this talk is maybe provide more templates for how to run these meetings. The things that I found when I first started trying to build a security champions program, I found a lot of documentation on the benefits that they provide, but not a lot on like how to get buy-in or how to structure some of the training. Having had experience building teams and training programs before, security champions seemed like a natural fit. Oh, I remember the point I wanted to add. Specifically, the thing that surprised me the most about security champions when I started doing the training is I thought the role that security team would have in a security champions program is much more like a facilitator. You help guide to the project, you help answer or unblock them as they move towards their own goals or their own learning goals. And I had this assumption because that they are very bright, highly skilled individuals that it would be, much more hands-off in the learning component, and that was not at all the case. It's not that they're not bright or unskilled, it's that they're not security domain is not their focus. And so a lot of them came in and I was like, great, what do you guys want to talk about? And there was like this, I don't know, you tell me sort of moment that was very funny. And so if I had to do it again, I'd probably start by saying you should be very hands-on at first until you move them into this confidence where they feel like they can make these decisions.
Okay, makes total sense.
Okay, last call for questions. Anything else?
There was one here from Bruce. Does the Security Champions program work in organizations with a mature security program? Or is it ideal for smaller startup types of organizations?
A good question, and not one that I can answer from personal experience. I've mostly worked in the startup world, and so that's where I have seen a lot of benefit and a lot of return. But I don't see why it couldn't work in a larger organization. And when I talk to peers, when I've had discussions with them about security champions, not all of us are in the startup space. I'm sure that the stakeholder buy-in portion is probably going to look a lot different, though, is what I might say. And demonstrating return on an investment, so the cohort size is probably also going to look a little different. I unfortunately can't answer that from experience because all of my personal experience has been in the startup space. Sorry, Bruce, I wish I could give you a little bit more there.
That's okay. I do have a comment about that. The first Security Champions program that started this whole trend of talking about security champions, I think started with Adobe or something like this. So like clearly it does work in larger organizations. It's just a slightly different beast.
For sure.
And then Caleb had a follow-up question. Have you found security champions are more or less willing to accept a finding as true positive than dedicated security engineers?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. Let me think about that for a second. I think it might depend on how long they've been a security champion for. I think reflecting on my own experience in this space, when you first get introduced to security, everything seems like the sky is falling. And there's sort of this level setting that goes on where you have to learn to do the evaluation on risk and impact and likelihood. And so security champions being more or less willing to accept a finding as a true positive, one, it would depend on the source. I don't think that they would necessarily trust automated tooling, but when we're showing them how to do red teaming, how to do penetration testing, I find that they're much more likely to accept it. And then again, as they gain experience, that ability to level set and really get a sense of what the true positive rate is. I see an answer from Caleb as well. I find it depends on the individual, some care less, but some like to fix any possible code quality issue. Can really swing either way. Yeah, that's a really good point too. It's easy to speak in broad terms, but individuals will always have their own approach to this sort of thing.
I had a personal question. So I have been looking at a lot of different ways of coaching like security problems as accepted engineering concepts. And you mentioned that same thing in your talk. So do you have any examples of like things that you did that worked? Any specific like security issues that you, and like what was the pitch and what was the topic that you did manage to get the engineering team to see like that there are, what is it, synergies or whatnot?
So you're referring to the idea of how to make the sales pitch almost to an engineering team.
Yeah, and what topics do you pitch to them as like accepted engineering concepts and why?
I think the most successful one is always going to be the size of the return on investment for early detection, shifting left in their pipelines. If you couple that with something like a recent demonstrated vulnerability in their system where you can partner it and say, look, we found it here and it took your team X number of hours and it took our team X number of hours to resolve, and we can demonstrate the cost of this issue. And then we can say, hey, if we get someone earlier, this issue was identifiable through X, Y, Z. Help us implement this, and we'll save you that X man hours. I think that pitch on being able to show that you can reduce the amount of time it takes to resolve a security issue is a good one. And if you combine that again with the real like this just happened, let's talk about it. People are much more willing to listen right after something. I hope that answers your question.
That answers part of my question. Any other pitches that you feel are effective that have worked for you?
Sure. So I think pitching to managers, you could probably also pitch the code quality approach. Engineering managers are still engineers, and approaching this from a point of view of its tech debt or code quality, or comparing it to other software engineering standards helps them grasp what you're talking about here. Comparing it to other industries can help too. So if you're talking about software composition analysis as a particular example here, comparing it to the supply chain industry is an interesting approach, because then you can start talking about how do you guarantee the authenticity or the security of things that you're incorporating into your application. So bringing talking points and comparing it to other industries is one good technique. Yeah, I think those would be an additional approach that you could take to this, which is drawing analogies to other industries or drawing analogies to other software ones around code quality, code smells, that sort of thing.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Appreciate the insight.
No problem.
And I think we're good from a questions perspective.
Okay, if people want to reach out to you, Connor, how can they do that if they have other questions or comments?
For sure. I guess probably the best way to reach me would be through LinkedIn. I check it probably once a day, so if you want to reach out, message me there, or connect with me if you're interested with one of the job postings that I mentioned today. I'm always happy to discuss coaching and mentoring, and especially in relation to security champions. This is something I feel really deeply is a great tool for changing security culture.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, if anyone has any other questions, just reach out to Connor. And thank you everyone for attending. And thank you again, Connor, for your presentation. Everybody, if you have any feedback or any needs or wants for future presentations, definitely use our feedback form. And big thanks to our sponsors, HP, Checkmark, Security Compass, Sonatype, Security Innovation, Amazon, and Shopify. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Connor.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.